One of the common themes in today's readings throughout them is that when healing happens, it not only is the somebody renewed, but it also changes the community of that somebody. Because when healing occurs, it opens up a window. It reveals an insight for us into our relationship and our understanding of God in our midst, and then moves us to a learning moment. Because to live is to learn. Darius Rucker, who's the lead singer of Hootie and the Blowfish, some of you may have Hootie and the Blowfish CD at home. They sold a lot of records. Darius Rucker went on to be a big country artist. I understand reading this week that Hootie and the Blowfish are back together and they're going to release a new record, which means a tour. Darius Rucker has this record that was a big hit in the country world for him. The chorus says, "You gotta live and learn so you can learn to live." You gotta live and learn so you can learn to live. Back in the first century, the Apostle Paul, well-schooled in the Torah, in the learning traditions of the rabbis of his time, he boldly preached and wrote of Christ's imminent return throughout his early letter. As time went by, though, as the Christian message began to spread, as Christian churches were planted and begun to grow, and Jesus didn't return, Paul's learning curve began to change. The communities he was now writing to had second, even third generation Christians in their midst. The first believers began to pass away. He had some that had just stopped living. They had just dropped everything because they were assured that Christ was going to return at any moment, so there was no reason to keep learning or living. Somewhere between Paul's writing of 1 Thessalonians and his other writings and those attributed then to him, the apostle gradually came to a new understanding. In short, Paul lived and learned that Christ's return may not be imminent. And Christians should live and learn as a faith community every day without the expectation, but always living in the anticipation of Christ's return. We call that kind of thinking here in the Valley an open innovation culture. It's built into some business models. Google is a very famous one. And part of the culture of this valley is to interact with the challenging experiences and informational input that surrounds us. It's not just solving problems, but it's really working on the notion of a prevailing thought and then saying, is that really the thought that we should be having, or is there a way to learn a new way to do something? Learning in the valley here is now seen as more of a lifelong process rather than an acquired ending. How can we innovate by bringing new learning, new understanding into our midst? The reason that I say in the valley is I really don't believe that that's the way that most of the country functions right now. And so it's going to be a gift, this open innovation culture, if we can impart this gift. And the reason I say I don't think that that's how most Americans think, this open innovation culture of learning to live and living to learn, is that every person that puts themselves forward for a governmental office, for an elected office, I don't care which side of the equation you're on, everyone that puts themselves forward, the first thing that the mainstream media does is they look at their past record, their past statements, their past speeches, everything that they've done and said all the way up to this point. And if that person has changed their mind, they beat them up for it. You're not allowed to have changed your mind if you're running for elected office. Because anytime someone says that they have learned or they think differently, the media wants to beat them up for it. So as a culture, we're not allowed to grow in our thinking or even change our minds. And I think that's tragic, that that's the prevailing notion, because that's not what the gospel tells us at all. The gospel tells us exactly the opposite. That whatever you are today, if you have an opening and a willingness to allow the Spirit to come into you, that's not just to reinforce what you already are, but to change you into something you can become. And oftentimes it'll be different than who you are right now. Last week I put on my Facebook page a blog that I had found. The guy's name is Tim Vellner. And I really was struck by this blog. I never read the blog before, but I was struck by what Mr. Vellner had written to his followers. He asked this question: what are the 5 most important things to you in life? And here's what he wrote down. He asked his followers to write it down, and this is what he wrote down. He said the 5 most important things to him in life is family, friends, security, wisdom, and having fun. Mr. Vellner writes in his blog, which I thought was so insightful. He said that things and concepts come and go. The experiences become us. They're the things of which we are made. And so of the things that he listed at some point that are going to be all swept away from him or taken from him, he decided to redefine his list of the 5 most important things to him in life as goals and the processes, the learning, so he could live, because he knew that what he would learn from it and live through it could never be taken away from him. So here's his new list. Experiencing life with my family, teaching, learning, and growing. Spending time with people I enjoy. Remember, it was about friends was the next one that he had. Working hard no matter what I do. Seeking to learn and to grow from every experience. Seeking joy and understanding in both the ups and downs. You can see that what he's done, he's shifted from things into how it's made the fabric of his life different. He's been altered. He's been changed in a way. If I take you back to the early part of Luke's gospel, we have the story of Jesus as a boy. And he goes to the temple. And he's talking to the teachers. And Luke indicates that Jesus is a boy. He's 12 years old. And then he notes that this young Jesus, this boy Jesus, goes back to live in Nazareth. He's with his parents. And he goes into obscurity. We don't hear anything more about Jesus from the time he's 12 for 18 years to around 30 or maybe a little older. 18 years. What was he doing in those 18 years? Here's what Luke writes about it. Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. So from the time he was 12 to when he was 30 and he started his public ministry, he was learning to live. He was living and he was learning and he was integrating divinity and humanity to become the most fully integrated human being who has ever lived. The region in today's setting was known for its diversity of people and also for its lack of integration. A coastal town, and there were some Jews. And so there was insiders and there were the outsiders. And there's no doubt that for Jesus, this encounter in this gospel is a living and learning moment when this persistent and persuading woman is encountered. There's a living and learning moment that's occurring here. Jesus had already performed a healing miracle of a Gentile man back in Mark 5, just a couple chapters before us. So there must be something else that Mark wants us to get from this confrontational dialogue. Dialogue is a Greek word. It means the sharing of ideas, not the drilling down and pulling it apart, which is what the Latin word of discussion means, but dialogos, the sharing of ideas that might differ. But it was a way for people to learn, to think differently, to think in a new way, to believe in a new way. Enables Jesus to come into a deeper, wider awareness of his own mission, of God's mission through him, of God's all-encompassing love through him, living and learning in this moment. Her response when Jesus uses that sentence that connects dogs and children is really more than a quick comeback or a rhetorically gifted response. I believe that statement is powerfully prophetic. Because whether this exchange illuminates gender or political or social inequality and imbalance, it is the courage of this woman that confronts a deeply ingrained and assumed normality. Now, it's important to note that nowhere in this exchange does this mother dismiss or dispute the primacy of the house of Israel or of Jesus' special responsibility as the son of David to tend to those lost sheep. And this is from The Voice. I love the parentheses because they've kind of helped us understand the tenor of the syntax of the scripture. Jesus smiling and nodding. I get it. I understand it. I just went into the culture of innovation. This is a wise saying. Go back home. Your daughter is free of the spirit that troubled her. So the reason that this scripture is so important for us today, it's more than a healing story. Miracles are awesome. They're wonderful. But this is about Jesus learning, living, and learning. It provides, however, theological tension for us, doesn't it? Mark is reminding us with this of the incarnation of God through Jesus wasn't a cakewalk or completed in advance. There were living and learning moments, both being fully human, which we sometimes forget, and fully God that was being revealed in this scripture. This learning moment was a diminishing of Jesus, not his authority through this exchange, but it was actually an expansion of his wisdom and of his power and of his authority, as we see in the narrative that continues with Mark telling us another healing story. God's table, grace, is open for everyone. And it is a mystery, but it is our reality that we are the ones on this corner of Grant and Cuesta in Silicon Valley and Mountain View that God has given us the responsibility and the gift to choose and extend the invitation of God's grace as the hands and face of Jesus to everyone that we encounter. When healing happens, not only is somebody renewed, it also changes the community of that somebody, because healing opens up a window, reveals an insight into our relationship and our understanding of God in our midst, and moves us, changes us into a learning moment, because to live and learn together encourages us to learn to live.